It was delicious. And that's the most important thing about the entire day, the carrot cake. So just remember that. This session is going to be presented by Ali Law, who's managing partner at Variety and Digital Transformation at Hanya Partners. And this is a subject that comes up time and time again, how to close the gap between the IT sector of the business and the rest of it. So, Ali, over to you. Thank you.
So to start with, a bit about me. So I've spent about half my career in consultancy and half in places like Royal London and HBOS. But actually, more importantly, what you need to know is I'm a geek. So I've always loved sci-fi, and one of the best moments recently is we got BritBox, which means I can see Blake 7, Space 1999 and UFO, if you remember those, if you're as old as I am. But I think that's always been my interest, is what technology can do. And when you see some of these older programs, and then the big heavy hitters like Star Wars, Star Trek, I guess being a proper sad geek, it was just what kind of future technology can bring and the impact it can have. And of course, it always worked, unless Captain Kirk was screaming at Scotty to do it in half an hour instead of 5 days, which was my introduction to engineering, I suppose, back in those days. So that's always coloured my career all the way through it, and it's been fantastic to see some of the things that were only in sci-fi back in those days come forward. So I think if you scroll forward to now, I think there's no doubt we live in a digital world, but what does that actually mean? And even pre-pandemic, the pace of change was just immense. And I'll put my card on the table. I think IT leadership is a hard gig and is getting harder, and I'll talk a bit about why I think that going forward. But if you think about it, the pace of change, it's not just what's happening, it's the period between major changes is getting shorter and shorter. All the research will tell you all of that, and we experience in our day-to-day lives. But then, of course, the pandemic did hit, and the digital surge, I think McKinsey's call it, then happened. And the response to that has been phenomenal in terms of how we've, as a world, adapted quickly to some of the challenges that went in such a horrific period of time. But I think what it's done is also raised expectations, and they were always high. But 58%, I think, there's a stat I read last week that says I've got online streaming services in the UK. And I bet you only a fraction of those understand what goes on behind the scenes to allow that to happen. Probably don't know about Netflix and their chaos monkeys and simian armies and all the rest of it. They just switch on their device and it works. So the expectations for IT are now way up here, which is adding to the dynamic that I think is quite tough for IT leadership. Which gets you to the relationship between IT and other areas of the business, and has it always been as good as it could have been and actually needs to be in this kind of environment. So I'm going to wait to play a little animation. Now, it's deliberately retro because that's what I asked for, and it was done by my daughter. Now, my daughter did her degree a couple of years ago, and as part of her final year, did an augmented reality phone app. So that's what the people coming out of universities are capable of doing nowadays. So this is actually a little bit of fun and a little bit tongue-in-cheek. So, over the years, I've heard many descriptions for IT. That one is about Fortress Castle IT, where there's just a wall around the operation and you just don't get in. I've heard other things. I think one of the analysts a few years ago talked about a bonbon no men, and we've all heard the phrase, I really hate with passion, the business and IT, how to set yourselves apart. I mean, how to talk. I mean, we do, to be fair, talk a different language at times. But it's almost like, if you're old enough, you remember the clangers on the moon. It's almost like a bunch of little aliens walking around speaking a different language as the perception it creates. I'll talk a bit more about language in a wee while. But not every organisation like that, don't get me wrong. There are organisations where IT is firmly at the table within their organisations, but there's still a gap in a lot of organisations. And why should we care about that? We should care because in the kind of digital environment we're talking about, organisations are going through a lot of change. They've got a lot of competition. Some are wondering when someone's going to in and completely disrupt the industry. Others are wondering about how can I reach new customers or new segments with new offers. Others just want to defend what they've got. But it's moving so fast. How do you get your head around all that? I think even before pandemic, I used to say that every business is an IT business. Therefore, IT is everyone's business. You can't survive now where IT is walled off from everybody else. I mean, my argument would be it never could, but even now so it's more crucial. So that all speaks to something that we need to do differently. And for leaders in IT, it does mean, I think, it's got to start with ourselves. And it's about how we build bridges and about trust. So some big hitting terms there. What is opportunity and why now? There's two key questions in all of that. Now, I've already talked about the fact that organisations need to be able to compete in this world. They need to be able to make sense of what's happening. Some want to innovate more, some want to move at more pace. But think about something different. We're in a war for talent now. There's a worldwide shortage of some skill sets and good experience. That's been going on for a while. It's actually a lot more acute now since we started to come back out of the pandemic a little bit. I know it's not over, but you can still see the demand out in the marketplace. We've not enough people coming into the industry, and we don't have enough of key skill sets like cloud and a lot of others you can mention. So think about it from the candidate's viewpoint. If you're sitting there and you've got a choice between a company that's got clear purpose, clear values, where IT is valued, where it's seen as integral to what you do, versus a company where IT is getting a lot of stick, where it's walled off, where they're accused of different things, which one are you going to choose? So it's actually a key part of your attraction and retention strategies. It's not just about getting them in, it's actually about keeping them. Why now? Well, now's the time to do it, because if you're not doing it, somebody else definitely is. So all that's sort of floating around in the mix. But that's quite an interesting statement. I remember talking to Agile Scotland about 15 years ago, and the subject was programmers are people too. And I'm not convinced the industry's moved an awful lot further in the last 15 years and recognise some of this. I think in some areas we definitely have. You'll see more people talking about psychological safety, and actually we've got to be able to get diversity into the workforce. We need to look for extroverts and introverts and make it so that everybody can be productive. But actually it's not really about the technology. And the perceptions we've got is always an interesting challenge. So if you look on YouTube, you can find some blooper reels from Star Trek. I told you he was a geek, where Captain Kirk walks into the door because it didn't actually open when he thought it was going to do, which sadly I find quite hilarious and probably says more about me than anything else, I suppose. But it's not actually about the tech, it is about the people. And if you look at the diversity of the workforce and the roles we've got, there are three fundamental things that I think then spring to mind. One, we don't talk enough about value. We are in a relationship business, and actually trust is central to all of this. And trust is another interesting term because it can be something that people just blurt out, oh, I trust X or I don't trust Y. It's much more nuanced than that. And if you start to think about trust more explicitly, it can help you take action that starts to build that more deliberately than if you're just operating out of instinct. So if you recognise and accept that actually we are a people business, then it leads you into, so what do you do? A lot of organisations, even pre-pandemic, were playing around with organisational structures and with different ways of doing it. Some were heavily technology-led. A lot of the big Chinese outfits definitely went down that path. Others, like some of the banks in Holland, started applying the Spotify model, and you start to see things like tribes, squads, chapter guilds, all the kind of terminology. If you are a sad geek like I am, you recognise from D&D anyway. But it's a new language, but it is indicative of a different way of doing it that is fundamentally different from how organisations have worked for a lot of years. So, aside from the big plays, what can you do that doesn't rely on that? And I've written some there, which I can see everybody's reading in advance, which is quite cute. So, I talk about building better bridges. You've got to start with yourself. This isn't going to happen just by osmosis. It actually needs deliberate action. And one of the things that I've always believed is good leaders are good storytellers, not in the figgy sense, but actually in a sense that brings things alive that people can aspire to, can generate motivation. And that applies to inside your own teams, but also how you start to bridge gaps into other areas of the business. By the way, we should run a pop quiz. If anybody's got a better thing rather than the business and IT, I'd love to know what it is, because I find myself going through sort of contortions to get around that one. But the key thing here is we talk different languages. And if you look at it, I looked at our report last week about what CIOs should be paying attention to in 2022. And the list was enormous, from only about 10 people. Started with the metaverse, it went on to crypto, Bitcoin, it went into naughty things like automation apparently, went through to low carbon tech. I mean, it was just a series of lists of things. Now, those are all probably languages we would recognise, but if you're not steeped in IT, how do you make sense of all that? So a couple of examples there. At one stage, we were rolling out a brand new architecture, and we wanted the board to understand what that was. So rather than death by PowerPoint or anything else, I got the IT team to run a play, which, by the way, they hated, but they did it and loved it in the end anyway. So that started with a customer arriving, it started with a bouncer being security, with a lady running about messages to mimic the API frameworks. Now, it sounds a bit naughty, but it was very visual. We injected a bit of fun in it, and the non-execs were able to relate to that when we were doing presentations after that about how the thing was progressing. So be innovative about how you tell your stories. Try to make it visual. Try to make it a bit unique. That's where I find digital marketeers are often really good allies in this sort of thing. They've often got really creative ideas. Another thing we've done in the past is we had a big regulatory project to get in on quite a complex system. And going into a steering group, we knew that there were going to be stakeholders agitating to go faster. So we give them a visual that said, here's the total system, boxes are the size of the system, colours the amount of legacy technical debt that exists in it. We picked the smallest one, which is actually green, exploded it out to show all the different pathways through that needed to be tested before we could go live. That was the last pressure we got to actually move faster in that project, because everyone understood if we cocked that up, then the consequences just weren't worth it. So find ways to engage and relate to the stakeholders in a way that brings it alive and what it means for them as well. And if you think about trust, part of trust is about credibility. So all that plays into that. You can't trust what you don't understand unless you've got a lot of trust in the individual. So giving transparency into that in a way that they relate to really plays into credibility around that. And then, it's interesting, I was thinking about this. The IT leader's gig is a hard job at the best of times. Now I'm saying be a storyteller, but now I'm also saying be a salesperson. There's an old saying in IT, good news goes nowhere, bad news gallops. If you don't talk about the value that you create and your teams create, nobody's going to do it for you. Unless you're really lucky, and I have worked for outfits that have this, where other people encourage and tease out the value for you. Now, that isn't like a car salesman. Sorry to any car salesman or either online or in the room. It's authentically talking about the value. And that's different from saying you're 99.9% available this month. That's kind of interesting, but so what? What does that actually mean? So in reality, in my early days as a consultant, I was taught that as soon as you walk on site, everybody's watching you and you've got to deliver value. And I think that applies to any sort of leader in an IT function, whatever. You've got to find a way to connect what you do to the value that it brings for the organisation and for your customers, and talk about it and keep talking about it. At one job I had, I decided that we would produce invoices from an internal function every month. And it drove the conversation that said, here's the value you get for the cost that you're paying, not shying away from that conversation. And that led to some interesting conversations. Well, I don't want to pay that much. Well, what do you mean by that? You can see where some of these kind of conversations go. But front into it, have the open conversation, force the value conversations. And there, again, there's some really interesting things you can do about that as well. I mentioned language earlier. I used to work for a company that specialised in how do you make action happen in the world. And all action happens through language. But one of the also very important things is perceptions created through language. So if you use the phrase business and IT, you're immediately setting yourself apart. And that's not a good thing. Why is it not a good thing? In a digital world, you need a whole organisational response. And it's incumbent on us not to align but to actually inform business strategies with what the art of the possible is. And some of it's moving faster than CEOs can get their heads around. So you can only do that if you start to talk, build the bridges by simplifying it, help them relate, and then talk to them and make sure that you avoid phrases like business and IT. Talk about the outcomes and values. I'm an engineer by trade. My dad would contend otherwise because he's a real marine engineer. And because I don't get my hands dirty, he thinks that means I don't qualify. We've got a lot of engineers. We love activity. We love talking about what we can do. Actually, people are more interested in what it means to them, what's the value going to create and what outcomes are going to come out of it. So concentrate on that. I always find I'm a project manager by trade. Milestones are an interesting thing. Outside of change, people don't really know what a milestone really means to them. So you've just finished system testing, so what? What's more powerful are proof points, where you can demonstrate something that has real-world value and isn't just an artificial construct, that is useful for measuring progress, but is no use in terms of talking about value. You need both. But proof points are a really powerful way of bringing it alive and show up what's in it. I deliberately put in so what. I've lost count to the amount of test reports I get, and the first question is, so what? You've got 86% automated coverage. Yeah, but is that 40% the high-risk area or not? What does it actually mean? If you're hiring good people, ask them what it means, ask them what they think, not just what the base facts are talking about. So that's why language is hugely important through all of this. Lastly, you've got some key areas where you can get a lot of value anyway. Help desks are a brilliant source of value, and one where typically we see a lot of help desks that just aren't effective. Sometimes because efficiency has been driven in so hard, actually they're a post box. They're not really adding value from that sense. But when you start to build in automation that helps people self-serve when they want to, when you actually start to get people that can handle and talk to the colleagues in a way, or customers even, in a way that gets underneath the concerns and it isn't time boxed to say, that's done, that's how you're measured. If you start to get that, help desks have a bigger reach than anything you'll ever do. So how many people in organisations actually are ever involved in change projects versus how many touch a help desk? My laptop power jack got bent last week. Phoned our help desk, got a replacement in my house. I was staying in the middle of the country up near Cooper within a day. That's great service. Now, I had another laptop where I could switch the power between the two of them, but stop pain in the butt. That kind of thing's brilliant. And actually, when people phone to complain, that's when you've got the most power to make a really great intervention, make a really great customer experience. These are things that are known to the customer service industry. It's not new, a lot of this kind of things. Applying to help desk can make a lot of difference. Really starts to build the perception within organisations that IT actually know what they're doing. And another part of trust, care about what that means for the other individuals. Depending on what trust model you get, that would be called intimacy on that side, and actually being more concerned about what it means for them. The other big thing is change adoption. I think IT, for a long time in a lot of organisations, if you can implement it well from a technical sense, job done. But actually change adoption starts at the very first point when you're starting to consider about things. And change adoption for me is a mixture of skills, all people focused, and can include things like digital marketing as well. But really looking under the skin of it. If you want value, then it's got to be used. And how do you get it used? You've got to understand what it is you're doing from a human viewpoint, not just from a technology viewpoint. You've got a chance to up front change what's created. You can help in the design. You can guide all the way through the project. It's not a case of 2 weeks before we go live, writing the comms plan and doing a bit of training. So there's so much value you can get from real good change adoption right at the front, and there's some wonderful stuff coming out and research all the time about, I first heard the term cognitive load from Gartner about 10 years ago. You're now starting to see it showing up, how different types of change, people react differently, the brain's wired differently to react to it. All this kind of things is getting real world usefulness within change adoption. And in a world where a lot of people are still remote, how you can reach out to people, how you can do teaser campaigns, all the good things digital marketers are really, really good at can make a big difference. We did a Teams implementation a few years ago, and it was a digital team that ran it for us. And I can't remember the stats now, but Microsoft came in and audited and said it was one of the best adoption rates they'd ever seen. And I actually put that down to the digital marketers didn't really care about how good the technology was. They were caring about how it changed what people did and how it could make lives easier and what's in it for them. So I would encourage you to think about what you've already got and how you can make that better use of that, because all that starts to help to bridge the gap, build the bridges. If your change adoption's out talking to people right before you even start all this and it's not dumped at the back end of a project, you start to get the trust where people see you, understand that you're looking to build trust, and you can go from there. I've talked a lot about trust, and the only other thing I'd say is think about it explicitly. We operate out of instinct quite a lot, but if as soon as you start to think deliberately about how it's going to impact the different areas of trust and how it can do that, can make a big difference. And all that can be done irrespective about doing a digital transformation, an agility transformation, cloud native, technology first. Doesn't matter which one path you're following, all these kind of things can make a difference. That's all I was going to cover, so happy to take any questions on any of that.
Anybody got any questions? You know, that point, well, I'm going to bounce this around the room. That point you were making about a better phrase than business and IT. Any thoughts on that, anybody? I mean, I work in the communication industry, and I was thinking to myself, you know, business information, business communications, enablement, implementation, delivery, facilitation. That makes sense to anybody, any of it? Yeah.
Yeah, good morning. So it's Sean Sadler from CGI. It's very relevant, actually, you know, and I know lots of IT leaders that have tried to change their IT department's name. So I know you've gone through various different iterations so that the business can relate more to IT. Information services, digital sports centre, you know, everything's going digital. And I think it is incumbent upon, going back to your point, Ali, trying to ensure that your team is perceived as being really part of the business, you know? It's not a separate function.
But part of that, Sean, is to actually, and I was thinking maybe you should just call it business, end of, you know, but then again, if you're recruiting, you have to sort of differentiate and say, well, actually, this is the part of the business we want you to go into.
Yeah, and I think that's why partly some of the more radical business models that are going towards sort of product teams, where by default they are multidisciplined from the different areas of business, are a really powerful way. I mean, it doesn't suit everybody, but it is a powerful way to start to bridge those gaps, because it forces people to work together and really start to value each other, provided you set the right context, of course, otherwise it can be just as bad. But it does help, but it's not the only way of doing it. But I've been trying to rack my brains for 15 years for a different phrase and failed.
Yeah. Gentleman back there, please. We can get a microphone to just behind you, Pete. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Bobby, Radically Digital. So in my experience, IT specifically, especially with most younger hires into the space, is really seen now as a bit of a it's like seen as a very outdated word. So if you were to say, oh, you work in IT, the instant response from everyone I know in tech is, no, I work in tech. Because IT has a connotation of password reset, help desk solely. So I think technology teams is a lot more prevalent in a lot of younger companies now, or your digital teams, like Sean kind of mentioned earlier. Whereas IT, saying, you know, oh, it's the IT team, even within companies is seen as a bit of like a no-no.
Talk about IT teams, and I think about the Channel 4 program.
Yeah, the IT crowd, exactly.
You know, the IT crowd, and you think, God, no,
Yeah.
no, wrong, all wrong, all wrong. But so, I mean, what would be your thoughts on it then? I mean, what would you bounce? You know, how would you phrase it?
Cool. So generally, when we talk about it to our clients, we talk more around bridging that gap between the business and their technology teams. So it's a subtle difference in the phrasing, but it's more just in terms of when you're recruiting. If you're recruiting someone into your IT team, they're less likely to kind of respond to that job ad versus joining their digital team or even just the actual team name of that team they're going to be joining, like our, I don't know, front-end products team or application development team. as opposed to clustering under the group name of IT.
Okay, well, let's adopt your terminology. What does the technology team do for the business? Somebody define that?
Archie Gray recently retired. For me, the name isn't the key thing, it's the relationship. So in the old days, going way back to people who used to work and who retired, IT was seen as a servant providing a service. But IT is superbly placed to be a partner with the business. In fact, to lead the business. Because with the rate of change and all the skills that we've built up and all the talent that we have, we're the best placed people in the business quite often to actually lead the business. Not just in terms of IT, but in terms of sometimes even understanding the business better than the people who are supposed to run it.
It's a really powerful point because technologists do understand an awful lot more about the art of the possible, especially with some of the exponential technologies that are coming through. And being able to bring that to the party is quite a key part of even staying competitive, innovative, choose whatever driver you've got out of that. And creating the space to do that's hugely important now. I mean, more so than it's ever been, I guess. I mean, going back to the early days when it was all really about process automation, putting them into the systems, we're way, way beyond all that now.
Yeah. I would say flip it the other way and say that everybody has to have some degree of IT skill and knowledge, irrespective of where they work. I mean, there's also a school of thought now that we need to teach lots of kids how to program, because when they go to work, everybody needs to be a programmer, because everybody is responsible for managing or analysing data to some extent. So IT can't be in a box that everybody else forgets about and lets them do it. It's all about data and managing data and using information, so everybody needs to be, to some extent, IT literate at least.
Yeah, I'd go a bit further than that as well and say if you're on a board of directors, there's not one non-exec wouldn't be able to read a P&L, but how many of them understand their data and technology landscapes and what it means by that? Open question. Some boards will be heavily into it, some won't. But in a world where everything is about the technology to a large degree and so dependent on it, then I think it is incumbent on boards to actually really understand that. But it starts with us and our ability to take them on that journey, explain it in a way that they can actually connect into it. So it's not, I think we've got a ways to go in some of that.
You know, what you were talking about earlier about creating virtual invoices every month and saying, this is what we've done for you. It's actually, it's a very simple way of just demonstrating ongoing value.
Yeah, and it gets the conversation going, and sometimes it's really uncomfortable conversations because they can be challenging, but it's better to get into them. That same part of that role, we also inherited where we go out and ask all the different areas what they thought about IT. And it was IT back then. I accept the point around technology, it is a good one. And I actually said, that's fine, but we're going to tell you what we think as well, because it is a two-way street, it's not a one-way street. So, interesting enough, that got stopped not long after that one, so it's an interesting response to it. But it's about getting into the conversation, it isn't a one-way thing.
But the thing is, if you don't have the conversation, they're still going to be thinking it.
Yeah.
You know, at least it's getting out in the open and you can address the issues at the same time.
Yeah.
Ali, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, transition period now. We will kick off again here with Sean in about 10 minutes' time. Okay, thank you. Right. How are you doing? Oh, no, right, nice to see you. Right. One sentence, what are you going to be talking about?
Which is, it seems quite a common thing today. But at least that then means there's consistency in the message, doesn't it?